Well, there were all those stories at the time. There's stories about almost everything.
Yeah, that's the
About
thing.
how you didn't get along. You had
No,
to like one another.
we didn't get along. We were four guys. We had rows. It never got in the way of the music, no matter how bad the row was. Once the counting, we all gave our best. And that was a little later, too, which I think is a natural thing. Suddenly we've got lives and I've got children, and, the effort that we put in, because we worked really hard.
Ringo Starr finally reveals the painful truth about why the Beatles couldn't get along anymore. Ringo Starr sits back with a familiar half-smile and a thoughtful pause, the kind of pause that carries decades of memories when he finally opens up about the truth behind the Beatles not getting along. Ringo Starr does not speak with bitterness, but with honesty shaped by time, reflection, and survival. When people imagine the Beatles, they imagine harmony, brotherhood, and musical perfection. Yet Ringo Starr reminds everyone that behind the legendary songs and screaming fans, there were four very human men struggling to stay connected while the world pulled them apart. Ringo Starr explains that fame did not simply elevate the Beatles, it complicated everything, turning small disagreements into emotional earthquakes that shook the band from the inside. Ringo Starr recalls how the early days felt almost magical when John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr were united by hunger, ambition, and the simple joy of creating music together. During those years, the Beatles shared cramped vans, tiny hotel rooms, and endless laughter, building bonds that felt unbreakable. But Ringo Starr admits that success came fast and violently, leaving little room for emotional growth. As the pressure mounted, personalities that once balanced each other began to clash. Ringo Starr says the cracks were not sudden, they were slow, quiet, and deeply personal. According to Ringo Starr, one of the hardest truths to accept was how communication slowly disappeared. John Lennon became more distant, retreating into his own creative universe, while Paul McCartney pushed harder, driven by perfection and fear of losing control. George Harrison felt increasingly overlooked, his talent growing faster than his space within the band. Ringo Starr often felt stuck in the middle, watching friendships strain under expectations none of them had been prepared for. Ringo Starr shares that no one taught them how to handle being worshipped by millions while still trying to remain emotionally grounded. Ringo Starr describes moments in the studio that felt tense and uncomfortable, moments when silence spoke louder than arguments. The Beatles were no longer just four friends making music. They were a global brand, a business, and a symbol larger than any individual. Ringo Starr explains that every creative decision suddenly carried weight, turning artistic disagreements into personal wounds. John Lennon's sharp honesty could cut deeply, Paul McCartney's intensity could feel overwhelming, and George Harrison's quiet frustration often went unheard. Ringo Starr says he tried to stay calm, but even peacekeepers reach breaking points. Ringo Starr openly admits there were days he felt invisible, days when his role as drummer felt reduced to background noise amid louder egos. At one point, Ringo Starr even left the band temporarily, a moment he describes as both painful and necessary. That absence forced the Beatles to confront how fragile their unity had become. Ringo Starr remembers feeling relief mixed with sadness, realizing that stepping away was the only way to protect his mental health. When he returned, the issues were still there, but the awareness had grown. As Ringo Starr reflects, he emphasizes that the Beatles did not fall apart because they hated each other. Instead, they fell apart because they changed. People evolved, dreams shifted, and emotional needs became more complex. Ringo Starr explains that John Lennon wanted freedom, Paul McCartney wanted structure, George Harrison wanted respect, and Ringo Starr wanted peace. Those desires were not wrong, but they no longer aligned. Ringo Starr believes that if they had slowed down, listened more, and communicated honestly, history might have unfolded differently. Ringo Starr also speaks about how outside influences intensified the tension. Managers, business disputes, and creative control battles added layers of stress that eroded trust. The death of Brian Epstein left a massive emotional and managerial void that none of the Beatles were equipped to fill. Ringo Starr recalls how confusion replaced guidance and uncertainty fed resentment. Without a clear leader, personal insecurities began driving decisions, often with unintended consequences. Despite everything, Ringo Starr insists there was always love beneath the chaos. Even during arguments, even during cold silences, there was a shared understanding of what the Beatles had created together. Ringo Starr says that bond never fully disappeared, even when the band officially ended. The pain came from knowing how special the connection was and how impossible it had become to maintain. Ringo Starr does not romanticize the breakup, but he does humanize it. When Ringo Starr finishes this part of his story, he leaves viewers with a powerful realization. Legends are not immune to emotional struggles. The Beatles were not a fairy tale frozen in time, but four men navigating extraordinary pressure with ordinary emotional tools. Ringo Starr's candid reflection invites audiences to look beyond the music and see the fragile humanity behind it all. And just when it feels like the story is complete, Ringo Starr hints that there is still more truth to reveal about what really happened when the Beatles stopped getting along. Continues speaking with a calm honesty that only time can give, revealing how life after the Beatles forced every member to face emotional truths they had long avoided. Ringo Starr explains that once the noise stopped, the silence felt overwhelming because the band had been their identity for so long. Without daily rehearsals, studio sessions, and shared chaos, Ringo Starr felt both freedom and loss at the same time. The Beatles were no longer a shield, and each man had to stand alone with his thoughts, memories, and regrets. Ringo Starr reflects on John Lennon with a voice softened by forgiveness rather than pain. He describes John Lennon as emotionally fearless yet deeply fragile, someone who spoke sharply because he felt intensely. Ringo Starr believes John Lennon often struggled to balance vulnerability with public expectations. Fame magnified every insecurity John Lennon carried, and creative pressure turned emotional wounds into sharp edges. Ringo Starr admits that many misunderstandings came from pain left unspoken, not from lack of love. When Ringo Starr speaks about Paul McCartney, he chooses his words carefully, honoring both truth and respect. Ringo Starr acknowledges that Paul McCartney's drive kept the Beatles moving forward when everything else threatened to collapse. At the same time, Ringo Starr admits that Paul McCartney's need for control sometimes felt suffocating. The desire to protect the band slowly became a source of tension. Ringo Starr explains that leadership without emotional awareness can unintentionally divide people who once stood together. Ringo Starr then turns to George Harrison, and his tone becomes deeply reflective. He describes George Harrison as quietly evolving, spiritually searching, and creatively expanding beyond the limits placed around him. Ringo Starr regrets that George Harrison's voice was not always heard when it mattered most. As George Harrison grew into a powerful songwriter, the structure of the Beatles began to feel restrictive rather than supportive. Ringo Starr admits the band underestimated how deeply George Harrison needed space and recognition. Ringo Starr explains that healing did not happen overnight. It came slowly, through time, distance, and moments of honest reflection. After the Beatles ended, conversations became easier because expectations were gone. Ringo Starr says that laughter returned once pressure disappeared. Shared memories replaced old arguments, and understanding replaced resentment. Even when disagreements remained, they no longer defined the relationship. Ringo Starr learned that growth often requires separation before connection can be rebuilt. Ringo Starr speaks openly about the pain of losing John Lennon, calling it a wound that never fully closes. He explains that John Lennon's absence changed how he viewed the past. Arguments that once felt heavy suddenly seemed small. Ringo Starr believes that loss clarifies what truly matters. Music became a way to stay connected to John Lennon, allowing memories to live beyond physical presence. Through sound and emotion, Ringo Starr says the bond endured. Ringo Starr also addresses the way fans search for someone to blame for the breakup. He firmly rejects the idea of villains within the Beatles. According to Ringo Starr, there were no winners or losers, only people overwhelmed by circumstances no one had prepared them for. The Beatles were young men navigating global fame without emotional guidance. Ringo Starr insists that conflict does not erase love, and disagreement does not destroy legacy. As Ringo Starr reflects on the music, his pride becomes undeniable. Despite every struggle, the songs continue to connect generations. Ringo Starr believes that honesty within the music came from lived experience. The tension, love, frustration, and hope are all embedded in the sound. That emotional truth is why the Beatles still matter. Ringo Starr sees imperfection as the secret ingredient that made the band unforgettable. Ringo Starr shares a message that extends far beyond music. Relationships evolve, people change, and not every bond lasts forever in the same form. What matters is how those experiences shape who we become. Ringo Starr encourages compassion, communication, and emotional honesty, lessons he learned through pain rather than theory. He does not rewrite the past, but he respects it with truth. Ringo Starr ends with gratitude rather than regret. He is thankful for the journey, the friendships, the music, and even the conflicts that shaped him. The Beatles may not have always gotten along, but what they created together transcends disagreement. That shared legacy continues to bring people together across time. Ringo Starr believes that truth, when spoken honestly, keeps stories alive. And that honesty is what holds the audience until the final moment, refusing to let the story fade.